he gave away millions. He walked away from a megachurch he had built from nothing. He moved his family to places where nobody knew his name. For years, people called him the most radical pastor in America. But then he started appearing alongside figures his own followers did not trust. His teachings on communion sparked accusations. His house church movement struggled in ways he never expected, and the pressure on his family became impossible to ignore. He once said that leaders, including himself, receive so much feedback on everything they say that it becomes overwhelming. Now at 58, the man who spent decades telling others how to live for God is facing serious questions about his own path. And the answers are not what anyone expected. Francis Chan's life began with loss before he even had the chance to understand what loss meant. He was born on August 31, 1967, in a small apartment in San Francisco's Chinatown. And the moment he entered the world, his mother left it. She bled heavily during labor and never recovered. The newborn baby cried beside a body that would never hold him. He grew up hearing about her but never truly seeing her, because there was not even a single photograph of her in the family albums. For years he searched and came up with nothing. The only images he eventually found were old ministry pictures from Hong Kong, showing a young woman whose face felt both familiar and distant at the same time. His father suddenly had to raise 3 small children alone in a country that still felt foreign, and the weight of that responsibility shaped the home into a quiet and heavy place where survival mattered more than comfort. Francis grew up wondering how a loving God could allow a life to begin with such a price. Not long after that, the pressure became too much for his father to carry alone. When Francis was still a small boy, he was sent across the ocean to Hong Kong to live with his grandmother. The move felt like being dropped into another world overnight. Instead of busy American streets, he found narrow rooms filled with the smell of incense and the sound of whispered prayers in a language that felt old and mysterious. His grandmother was deeply devoted to Buddhism and filled the house with rituals that confused him. She burned paper offerings for the dead and warned him that spirits watched everything he did. He followed her into temples where golden statues stared down in silence while she bowed and chanted. At night he slept on a thin mat and listened to distant festival drums and fire crackling as paper money burned in the streets. Letters from home rarely came. The distance settled into his heart like a quiet loneliness that never fully left. Even after he returned to America, the sounds and images stayed with him, leaving him caught between 2 worlds that never seemed to fit together. Just as life began to feel stable again, tragedy struck once more. When Francis was 8 years old, his stepmother died in a violent car crash on a Los Angeles freeway. The family had only recently been reunited, and the sudden loss tore open wounds that had never healed. The accident happened on a rainy road where her car lost control and slammed into a truck, ending her life in seconds. Francis rode with his father to the morgue to identify her body. During that silent drive, his father wrapped an arm around his shoulders for a brief moment that Francis would remember for the rest of his life. It was one of the few times he felt physical comfort from the man who raised him. After that day, the house grew even quieter. Church hymns filled Sundays while memories filled the rest of the week. Francis kept his feelings locked inside, letting anger build in ways he did not fully understand. 3 years later, another blow came that changed everything. On his 12th birthday, his father died after a short battle with cancer. The day that should have been filled with celebration turned into a funeral. He watched the man who once stood strong slowly weaken, coughing through sleepless nights until the final breath came. There was no cake and no candles, only hospital sounds fading into silence. By the time the day ended, he was completely alone in a way that few children ever experience. He moved between relatives, carrying a mix of fear and emptiness that he could not explain. Looking back, the pattern seemed almost unreal. His mother died when he was born. His stepmother died when he was 8. His father died when he was 12. Each loss stripped away another layer of safety, and faith began to feel like a question instead of an answer. High school brought another shock that pushed him deeper into confusion. An uncle who had become one of the closest adults in his life exploded during a violent argument at home, shooting his wife before turning the gun on himself. The news reached Francis through frantic phone calls. When he arrived, the house was surrounded by police tape and flashing lights. The sight of body bags being carried away became another image that refused to fade. By the time he reached adulthood, death had marked nearly every stage of his life. The faces that should have formed his family had disappeared one by one, and the silence left behind felt louder than any voice. Through all of it, he struggled with questions that would not go away. The missing photograph of his mother left a blank space in his memory that nothing could fill. The rare moments of affection from his father felt small against the weight of everything that had happened. He often found himself alone with thoughts that circled back to the same point again and again. If God truly cared, why did life break so easily? The tension between the Buddhist chants he remembered from Hong Kong and the Christian teachings he heard in America only made the confusion deeper. Bitterness settled quietly into his heart, and doubt followed close behind. College became the place where things finally began to shift. The years of grief pushed him toward faith instead of away from it. He committed his life to Jesus with a seriousness that surprised even him. He enrolled at Talbot School of Theology at Biola University and studied intensely, determined to understand the truth that had once felt so distant. After graduating, he became a youth pastor at a church in Chatsworth. From the outside, everything looked right. He was energetic and passionate and spoke to teenagers in a way that made them truly listen. Yet inside, he felt deeply divided. While he taught about repentance and purity, he knew his own life did not always match his words. The gap between who he was and who he claimed to be slowly became unbearable. The weight of that conflict followed him day and night until he felt like a stranger inside his own skin. Eventually, he stepped away from ministry without making a public announcement. The change felt sudden to anyone who knew him, but for him it had been building for a long time. He found work as a waiter and traded sermon notes for order pads, learning table numbers instead of Bible passages. The quiet routine forced him to slow down and face himself honestly for the first time in years. During that season, he made a deep personal promise to live differently, not only in front of people, but also when no one was watching. The job that seemed like a step backward became the place where pride faded and faith began to feel real again. Around that same time, he married Lisa, the woman who would become the steady center of his life. She brought stability into a world that had always felt uncertain. Yet the early years of marriage were not easy. The grief he carried showed up in arguments and misunderstandings that left both of them exhausted. There were moments when he wondered whether the marriage would survive, because he felt torn between guilt over the past and fear about the future. Slowly, they worked through the pain together, learning that faith did not remove struggle but gave them the strength to stay. In 1994, they helped start a small church in Simi Valley with only a few dozen people gathering in a garage. The space was simple and crowded, filled with folding chairs and borrowed equipment. Yet something about it felt alive. Within weeks, more people began to show up, drawn by messages that felt honest and direct. The small group quickly grew beyond what anyone expected. The man who had once been waiting tables now stood in front of a growing crowd, speaking with a conviction that came from real experience. People were drawn to the intensity of those early gatherings. Teenagers and young adults packed into the garage, listening closely as he spoke about eternity and the seriousness of faith. Some left in tears. Others stayed afterward asking questions they had never dared to voice before. Families did not always agree about what they heard, but the conversations kept spreading and the church continued to grow. Over the years, the small gathering turned into a large church that filled a building with more than 1,000 seats. The growth felt almost unreal at times. Yet the urgency in his preaching never faded. He spoke about living fully for God and refusing to settle for comfort, and many people responded by genuinely changing the way they lived. In 2004, he started Eternity Bible College with a group of students committed to serious study and service. Some of them later traveled overseas to serve in poor communities, and watching their dedication stirred new questions in his heart. He began to wonder whether a church filled with spectators truly reflected the life Jesus described. Even as the church grew larger, he chose not to take a salary from it. He kept his personal needs simple and gave away most of the money he earned from books and speaking. Large portions went to organizations rescuing victims of human trafficking, because he believed money should be used to change real lives rather than create personal comfort. At home, his family continued to grow until the house was filled with 7 children. Lisa carried the weight of homeschooling and daily life while he traveled and preached. Although the outside world saw only success, the pressure slowly drained his strength. He kept going because people expected it, yet inside he often felt deeply exhausted. By 2008, thousands of people attended the church every week, and his books were reaching readers around the world. In the middle of that success, a quiet thought began to trouble him. He wondered whether Jesus or the Apostle Paul would have built something so large and organized, or whether they would have chosen smaller communities where every person played an active part. Sometimes he sat alone wrestling with the possibility that growth and recognition had slowly pulled him away from the simplicity he once loved. Those questions grew stronger with time, leading him toward decisions that would change his path once again. That same year, Francis Chan suddenly found himself known all over the world. His book Crazy Love spread faster than he ever expected and soon became a New York Times bestseller, eventually selling millions of copies. Not long before that, his agent had told him he might earn $1 million in royalties in a single year, and the idea had genuinely shaken him. Months earlier, he had prayed that God would make him rich, not so he could live comfortably, but so he could give everything away and prove that Jesus mattered more than money. When the checks finally came, he kept his promise. Every dollar went into an anonymous fund that supported charities across Asia and Africa, rescuing children and helping women trapped in trafficking. He refused to keep anything for himself. At the same time, the attention around him kept growing. Invitations poured in from conferences across the world, and every week thousands of people filled Cornerstone Church just to hear him preach. From the outside, it looked like success in its purest form. Yet the more famous he became, the more uneasy he felt inside. The crowds were large and the money was real, but something about it felt dangerous to him. He worried that comfort and recognition could slowly pull him away from the kind of faith he believed Jesus truly asked for. So while other well-known pastors upgraded their homes and traveled in luxury, he moved in the opposite direction. After visiting poor villages in Uganda and seeing children with almost nothing, he downsized his home from 2,000 square feet to roughly half that size. The decision shocked people who assumed that success should naturally lead to more space and more comfort. Even at the height of his influence, he refused to build a financial safety net for himself. He gave away half of his personal income and chose not to take a salary from the church. Cornerstone itself followed the same direction, giving away more than half of its entire budget to global missions and relief work. There were no expensive cars and no luxury vacations. He and his wife quietly signed over the income from Crazy Love so the money could fund missions without their names attached to it. Some pastors said he was taking things too far, but Chan pushed back whenever he spoke about it. He asked why simple obedience to Jesus sounded extreme when Jesus himself had told people to sell everything and follow him. Many of these convictions grew stronger during the years he traveled overseas. He spent time with orphans in Ecuador and Uganda, sometimes holding sick children who did not survive the night. Those moments stayed with him long after he returned home. American comfort started to feel dull, and the huge church he led began to feel heavier with each passing year. Even his own family felt the true cost of this way of living. There was no financial cushion and no long-term security, only trust that God would provide. But Chan believed that living this way gave real weight to the message he preached. In 2008, he stepped away from the church for 3 months because he needed time to think and pray. When he returned, he was deeply troubled by what he saw in American Christianity. Too many people seemed satisfied with sitting through sermons while doing very little with their faith. He began teaching that every believer had spiritual gifts meant to be used rather than hidden. He pushed the church toward smaller groups where people would pray for one another and serve actively instead of staying passive. Some members reported healings and answered prayers, while others felt uncomfortable with the changes. Attendance dropped for a time, yet those who remained became more deeply committed. He believed the church should release people into ministry instead of keeping them comfortable inside a building. He often pointed to underground churches in places like China as examples of faith that stayed strong without large programs or expensive facilities. Long before this shift, he had started Eternity Bible College under the umbrella of Cornerstone. By the late 2000s, the school had trained dozens of students who went into difficult mission fields around the world. Chan visited some of them in Ecuador, hiking into mountain villages where graduates baptized new believers in rivers and preached despite real threats of violence. He watched them face malaria and danger with a courage that stirred something deep in him. While people praised the success of the college, he privately admitted that he sometimes envied the small churches he visited, places where everyone knew each other and every person played a meaningful role. His own church had thousands of people, yet he worried that many of them felt anonymous, as if they were part of a crowd rather than a family. The more he thought about it, the more he wondered whether his growing influence was actually getting in the way of the kind of church life he truly believed in. Those doubts finally came into the open on April 18, 2010. Standing before thousands of people at Cornerstone, he announced that he was stepping down as pastor. He said he believed the megachurch model wasted the spiritual gifts of too many believers because most people came only to sit and listen. Buildings and programs cost millions of dollars, yet simple gatherings around the world were growing without any of that. Some in the audience cried. Others sat in silence, too shocked to respond. But Chan felt utterly convinced he had to follow this path. Soon afterward, he sold his house and moved into a simpler life focused on small house churches in San Francisco. Without a salary and without a large platform, he trained unpaid leaders to guide small fellowships that slowly multiplied. The move confirmed what he had long suspected, that faith could grow deeply even without a famous name attached to it. Looking back, the rise of Cornerstone had been remarkable. What began in 1994 with only 30 people had grown into one of the largest churches in Ventura County, forcing the building to expand again and again as attendance climbed into the thousands. Chan also became connected with several major ministries, serving on boards and supporting projects that provided food for struggling families and help for orphans around the world. His preaching, his books, and his speaking events created a reach far beyond his local church, and people began to see him not just as a pastor but as a global voice. His sermons carried an intensity that many listeners never forgot. Long before online videos made preaching widely famous, recordings of his messages spread because he spoke with a kind of urgency that challenged comfortable faith. He often confronted wealthy Christians about ignoring suffering believers in other parts of the world, and his words stirred strong reactions. Many were inspired to give more and serve more. But some critics felt uneasy, saying the devotion of his followers sometimes seemed too centered on the man himself. The same passion that drew people in also raised serious questions about how much influence one leader should hold. He wanted his own life to reflect the message he preached. So he often took his family on long mission trips across Asia. He traveled with 7 children and a wife who was sometimes pregnant, living in tight spaces and moving from place to place as they visited churches and orphan homes. Publicly, these trips looked like bold acts of faith. Yet the strain on the family was real. Lisa Chan later shared how exhausting it was to raise so many children while traveling constantly and trying to meet expectations that felt impossible to sustain. Behind the scenes, she struggled with deep discouragement and moments of despair, even while appearing strong in public. The contrast between the admired ministry family the world saw and the private pressure they carried daily revealed just how costly their way of life had truly become. Through all of this, Chan's decision to give away his book income shaped how people perceived him. Signing over the royalties before the money even arrived turned him into a symbol of radical generosity, and many believers looked to him as proof that a pastor could refuse wealth and still remain genuinely influential. Cornerstone's habit of giving away a large share of its income only strengthened that image, and he became known as a leader who consistently practiced what he preached. Yet even during the years of growth, he could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. Week after week he stood before thousands of people and wondered how many of them were truly involved in active ministry. Scripture described a church where every single person served. But in a crowded auditorium, most people simply listened and then went home. This tension pushed him toward the changes that eventually led to his resignation and his search for a completely new way of doing church. Years later, new controversies surrounded him. In 2019, He spoke at a large event where he shared the stage with well-known charismatic leaders such as Benny Hinn, Todd White, and Bill Johnson. Photos of him greeting them warmly spread quickly online, and critics accused him of endorsing teachings he had once clearly rejected. Some leaders warned that he was giving credibility to people they considered dangerous teachers. Chan responded by saying he received hundreds of invitations each year and often spoke in places where he hoped to reach people who rarely heard sound biblical teaching. He admitted he had not researched every speaker on the program carefully and promised to seek more guidance from trusted elders going forward. But he refused to withdraw completely. The debate divided many who had once deeply admired him, with some defending his mission-focused approach while others felt his judgment had grown careless and irresponsible. That same year, he shared a story from a remote Asian village where he said he prayed for sick people and witnessed them recover immediately. The story stirred excitement among supporters who believed miracles were still happening today, but skeptics questioned the lack of verifiable evidence and worried that he was drifting toward exaggeration. For Chan, the experience confirmed his long-held belief that spiritual gifts remained fully active. Yet the divided reaction revealed just how far opinions about him had begun to split. Early in 2020, he sparked another wave of discussion when he preached about communion and said he had come to believe that Christ was truly and meaningfully present in the bread and wine in a deeper way than he had previously understood. He explained that studying early Christian writings had challenged his earlier views and led him to rethink the full significance of the Lord's Supper. Some listeners welcomed the new emphasis on unity and reverence, while others feared he was quietly moving toward Catholic theology. Rumors spread that he might eventually convert, though he continued to describe himself as Protestant. The conversation only deepened the sense that his journey was taking turns that few people had anticipated. On a Sunday morning in April 2010, around 5,000 people filled the seats at Cornerstone Community Church in Simi Valley, expecting the same passionate message they had heard from Francis Chan for years. The room felt completely normal at first. Families sat together. Friends talked quietly. Everyone waited for the sermon to begin. Then Chan walked to the front and said something that no one in the room expected. He told them he was resigning immediately. There would be no long goodbye and no slow transition. He said he believed that staying might actually do more harm than good. The room went completely still. Some people gasped. Others began to cry. Many simply stared forward, struggling to process what they had just heard. For years, he had been wrestling privately with a thought that deeply disturbed him. He once admitted that he wondered if the Apostle Paul or even Jesus himself had planted a church in Simi Valley, his own congregation might still end up larger. That idea shook him to his core. He never wanted people gathering around his name. He wanted them gathering around God. Walking away felt terrifying, yet staying felt far worse. After he left, the church did not fall apart. It kept growing in a way that quietly confirmed what he had believed all along. The work did not depend on any one person. In the months that followed, he made another surprising decision. Instead of using his influence to expand his own platform, he quietly moved his family overseas to a place where almost no one knew who he was. He stepped away from the comfortable life he had built in Southern California and left behind the kind of recognition that most pastors spend their entire careers trying to achieve. Friends told him he was making a serious mistake. Some said he was throwing everything away. But the more attention he received, the more uneasy he felt. The spotlight kept shifting toward him instead of toward Jesus, and living far from fame felt closer to the kind of life he read about in Scripture. Eventually, he returned to the United States and started small gatherings in San Francisco that later became known as We Are Church. These meetings did not take place in large buildings or auditoriums. They happened in living rooms. People sat close together and shared meals. They talked face to face instead of watching a stage from a distance. Everyone was expected to take part. Someone might teach. Someone else might pray. Another person might lead a song. Others cooked or served. The meetings felt simple and sometimes uncomfortable, but they felt genuinely real to him in a way that large polished services never had. He admitted openly that this kind of church life could be messy. When people sit close together, disagreements happen. Feelings get hurt and conflicts surface. Some people left because the intimacy felt too demanding. Yet he believed that kind of honest struggle looked far more like the early church than any perfectly polished Sunday service ever could. He wanted to prove that a real spiritual movement did not need a famous leader or a large budget. He believed faith could grow and flourish in ordinary homes where people truly and deeply knew each other. A few years later, he surprised people again by joining the elder team at a larger church called Abundant Life Christian Fellowship. Many who had followed his journey expected him to stay far away from traditional institutional churches, so his decision raised immediate questions. He was not there to build a bigger platform. He genuinely wanted to see whether a structured church could still live out the values he cared most about. At first, he appreciated the opportunity to serve in a different setting. Yet over time, he noticed familiar patterns quietly returning. Many people came once a week but stayed emotionally and relationally distant from one another. They listened to a message and left without forming any deep connection or real accountability. After a couple of years, he stepped down quietly. There was no public conflict. He simply felt pulled back toward a simpler and more honest way of doing church. The experience only deepened his conviction that he was not chasing an abstract idea. He was genuinely searching for the kind of community that produced real love and real obedience. His choices affected far more than his schedule. They changed his entire way of life. After leaving Cornerstone, he gave away large portions of his savings, including hundreds of thousands of dollars in book royalties. He refused to draw a salary from the new church network and chose a much simpler standard of living. Instead of bigger homes and greater comfort, his family settled into smaller spaces with fewer luxuries. While many pastors carefully built strong public brands, he avoided interviews and television appearances as much as he possibly could. People expected his influence to fade once the megachurch platform was gone. Yet the opposite happened. The small gatherings slowly multiplied and new leaders began to emerge. By 2020, the network had spread across multiple locations. The work continued quietly even without the fame that had once surrounded him, and that steady growth only strengthened his belief that ministry did not need popularity or celebrity to survive. The turning point behind all of these decisions remained deeply personal. He later shared that the most frightening moment of his life was not standing before thousands of people and announcing his resignation. It was the moment he honestly recognized how much he had come to enjoy being admired. Crowds gathered to hear him speak. His name appeared on book covers and event posters across the country. At first he told himself that the success meant the ministry was healthy and growing. But eventually he saw something else beneath the surface. People came to listen, yet many did not change their lives in any lasting way. The attention kept growing while real discipleship stayed shallow. And once he clearly saw that pattern, he could not ignore it. He knew that if he stayed, the cycle would simply continue. More crowds would come. More praise would follow. And the distance between the message he preached and the lives people actually lived might keep quietly widening. Walking away forced him to rebuild his entire identity from the ground up. Not as a famous pastor, but simply as a follower of Jesus trying to live with honesty and integrity. After stepping away from the megachurch world, he did not settle into a quiet retirement. Instead, he moved into a new season that surprised even his longest and most loyal supporters. Around 2020, he stepped back from the network he had built and began traveling again, speaking in smaller and more intimate gatherings and focusing on urgent warnings about the true state of the church. His messages became more serious and more direct. He spoke about consumer faith and comfortable Christianity and warned that many believers were slowly drifting away from genuine discipleship without even realizing it. For someone who had once filled enormous rooms with thousands of eager listeners, this quieter path felt profoundly different. He increasingly chose small meetings where conversations could feel personal and honest rather than public and performative. When he first began speaking about house churches years earlier, the idea had sounded beautiful and almost perfect. Small groups meeting in homes seemed to promise close relationships and shared responsibility. He believed this approach could solve the painful distance he had observed in large churches, where people listened politely and then returned home without any real connection to each other. The vision reminded him of underground believers in other parts of the world who gathered quietly and depended on one another completely. Reality turned out to be far harder than the vision. He later admitted that he had been too idealistic in his expectations. Small groups brought their own unique set of struggles. Personal differences became more visible and harder to avoid. Conflicts sometimes lasted longer because people stayed in close proximity. Some groups struggled to grow in any meaningful way, while others slowly faded entirely. A number of people eventually drifted back to larger churches where expectations felt lower and personal responsibilities felt lighter. Yet even with those disappointments, he found a kind of peace that had been entirely absent during his years of public success. The relentless pressure to impress crowds and maintain a strong outward image began to lift. Instead of measuring ministry by numbers and appearances, he focused on simple daily obedience. The work felt less polished and less impressive, but far more honest. And that honesty mattered far more to him than any perfectly curated ministry could. These changes touched his family deeply as well. He and his wife Lisa moved their household away from the center of church fame and into places where very few people recognized them. Their children grew up witnessing both sides of that life. They experienced the attention and expectation that comes with belonging to a well-known ministry family, and then watched their parents deliberately walk away from all of it. Some of their adult children later chose paths that took them across different cultures and into communities very different from the suburban church world they had grown up in. Those experiences shaped their understanding of faith in lasting ways and gave them a far broader picture of what it means to follow Jesus in the world. In recent years, his message has taken on a new and unmistakable urgency. Early in 2026, he shared that some of his most meaningful and treasured moments now happen in quiet mornings spent alone in prayer. He described long periods of silence where he felt an unusual clarity and a deep awareness of God's presence. These moments left him genuinely surprised and profoundly moved. Even after decades of public ministry, he said those quiet and unhurried hours still felt completely alive and fresh to him.